My name is Eloisa, and for 56 years, I believed that love was enough. I believed that if you gave everything you had, if you sacrificed until there was nothing left of yourself, if you loved someone so completely that you forgot how to love yourself, that it would be returned, that it would matter, that it would be seen. I was wrong. The morning it all ended started like any other. I was standing in my small kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals for my son Miguel, where I'd packed his school lunches with little notes telling him how proud I was, where I'd waited up until 2 in the morning when he was 17 and still learning to drive, worried sick that something terrible had happened to him. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar tune, and I was humming softly to myself, the way I always did when I was content. I didn't know that within an hour, my entire world would collapse. Miguel had been living with me for 3 years since he lost his job. 3 years of me tiptoeing around his moods, of walking on eggshells every morning, never knowing if I'd encounter the sweet boy I raised or the angry stranger he'd become. 3 years of me making excuses for his behavior to concerned neighbors, of pretending that his coldness toward me was just temporary stress, just a phase that would pass if I was patient enough, loving enough, understanding enough. He was 32 years old, and I was still taking care of him like he was a child, cooking his meals, doing his laundry, paying the bills while he looked for work that never seemed to materialize. But I didn't mind. How could I mind? He was my son, my only child, the only family I had left in this world. His father, my beloved Carlos, had died when Miguel was only 14, a heart attack at 45, sudden, brutal, final. One day, Carlos was laughing at the dinner table, telling us about the funny thing that happened at work, planning our weekend trip to see his sister. The next day, I was standing in a hospital corridor being told by a doctor with kind eyes that there was nothing more they could do. After Carlos died, it was just Miguel and me against the world. I worked double shifts at the nursing home, my back aching from lifting patients, my feet swollen from standing for 12 hours straight. Also, I could give Miguel everything he needed. I wanted him to finish high school, to go to college, to have the chances that Carlos and I never had. I wanted his father's death to be a tragedy, not a complete destruction of his future. I remember the nights when Miguel would have nightmares about his father, when he'd wake up crying and calling for Carlos. I'd sit beside his bed, stroking his hair, telling him stories about how his father was watching over us, how proud Carlos would be of the young man Miguel was becoming. I'd sing the same lullabies I'd sung when he was a baby, my voice cracking with exhaustion, but never stopping until he fell back asleep. Those were the moments when I felt closest to him, when I could see glimpses of the loving child he'd been before grief changed him. He'd look at me with eyes so much like his father's and whisper, "I love you, Mama." Those 3 words carried me through everything, through the financial struggles, through the loneliness, through the bone-deep weariness that comes from being the only parent, the only provider, the only source of stability in a child's shattered world. But somewhere along the way, those moments became rarer. The grateful smiles disappeared. The conversations became shorter, colder. The "I love you, Mama" stopped coming altogether. I told myself it was normal. Boys growing into men, children learning independence. I told myself he was still grieving, still processing his father's death in his own way. I told myself that if I just loved him enough, if I just gave him enough space and time and support, he'd come back to me. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment to let us know what city you're watching from. This particular morning, I'd made his favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with cheese, the way I'd been making them since he was 5 years old. I'd toasted the bread exactly the way he liked it, golden brown but not too crispy. I'd arranged everything on his plate with the same care I'd always taken, the same attention to detail that comes from loving someone so much that even the smallest gestures become acts of devotion. I called out to him, "Miguel, breakfast is ready," just like I had every morning for the past 3 years. Just like I had every school morning for 12 years before that. My voice was cheerful, hopeful. I was always hoping that today would be different. That today he'd join me at the table and we'd talk like we used to, like we did when he was younger, and I was the most important person in his world. Instead, I heard his bedroom door slam open so hard it rattled the walls. His footsteps were heavy, angry, purposeful. I turned from the stove with a smile on my face, ready to greet my son with the unconditional love I'd been giving him every day for 32 years. But the look in his eyes stopped me cold. There was something I'd never seen before. Not just anger, not just frustration, but genuine hatred. Pure, undiluted contempt directed at me. The woman who'd given him everything I had to give. "What?" he snapped, the single word cutting through the morning air like a blade. "I made your breakfast," I said softly, gesturing toward the plate I'd prepared with such care. "Your favorite." He looked at the food like it was poison, like my gesture of love was somehow offensive to him. "I didn't ask you to make me anything." I felt something crack inside my chest, but I kept my voice gentle. "I know, sweetheart. I just thought—" "You just thought what?" His voice was rising now, and there was a cruelty in his tone that I'd never heard before, not even during his worst teenage tantrums. "You thought I can't take care of myself? You thought I need my mommy to make me breakfast like I'm some kind of child?" The words hit me like physical blows. This was my son, the baby I'd rocked to sleep, the child I'd nursed through fevers and nightmares and broken hearts. This was the boy who used to climb into my lap when he was scared, who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them flowers for the most beautiful mama in the world. "Miguel, I was just trying to what? Control me? Make me feel guilty? Remind me every single day that I'm a failure living in my mother's house?" I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had apparently become a burden. The coffee getting cold, the breakfast I'd made with such hope growing congealed on the plate, the morning light streaming through windows I'd kept sparkling clean because I wanted our home to be a place of peace and comfort for both of us. "I've never thought you were a failure," I whispered, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "You're my son. I love you." But those words, the truest words I'd ever spoken, seemed to ignite something terrible in him. His face twisted with an emotion I couldn't name, wouldn't have recognized even if I could. And then he said the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life, the words that would change everything between us forever, the words that would finally teach me that sometimes love simply isn't enough. "Go live your life. I'm sick of you." The words exploded from his mouth like bullets, each one finding its target with deadly precision. But he wasn't finished. Oh no. My son had apparently been saving up years of resentment, and now it was all pouring out in a torrent of cruelty that left me gasping. "I'm tired of you hovering over me like some pathetic old woman who has nothing better to do with her life. I'm tired of your sad little breakfasts and your worried looks and your constant need to take care of me like I'm still 5 years old." I stood there, frozen, watching this stranger who looked like my child but spoke with the voice of someone who despised me. The plate of eggs was still in my hands, growing cold, and I realized I was gripping it so tightly my knuckles had turned white. "Miguel, please." "Please what? Please keep pretending this is normal? Please keep acting like you're not suffocating me with your neediness?" He laughed, and it was the most bitter sound I'd ever heard. "Do you know what people say when they see us together? They pity me. They think I'm some loser who can't cut the cord from his mommy." Each word was a knife twisting deeper into my heart. This was my son, the child I'd protected from every hardship I could, the boy I'd loved so fiercely that I'd forgotten how to love myself. And he was standing in our kitchen, in the home I'd worked myself to exhaustion to provide, telling me that my love was a burden. "I never asked for any of this," he continued, his voice growing louder, more vicious. "I never asked you to sacrifice your life for me. I never asked you to make me your whole world. That was your choice, your mistake, and I'm sick of paying for it." The plate slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor. The sound seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence, ceramic pieces scattering across the linoleum like fragments of my broken heart. The eggs splattered everywhere, on my slippers, against the cabinet doors, across the floor I'd mopped just yesterday because I wanted everything to be perfect for him. "Look what you did," he said, staring at the mess with disgust. "You can't even hold a stupid plate without making a disaster." I knelt down automatically, my hands shaking as I tried to gather the pieces. It was what I always did: clean up, fix things, make everything better. But as I crouched there on the floor, surrounded by the ruins of the breakfast I'd made with such love, something inside me started to break in a way I'd never experienced before. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. For loving him too much? For sacrificing too much? For existing? "Sorry doesn't change anything," Miguel said, standing over me as I cleaned up the mess. "Sorry doesn't give me back the life I could have had if you hadn't made me feel guilty every time I tried to leave this house, every time I tried to build something of my own." I looked up at him from my position on the floor, and for a moment, I saw his father in his face. But where Carlos had always looked at me with love, with appreciation for everything I did for our family, Miguel's expression held nothing but contempt. "I gave you everything," I said quietly, the words coming from somewhere deep in my chest. "After your father died, I gave you everything I had." "I didn't ask you to," he shouted, and I flinched as if he'd struck me. "That was your choice. You chose to make me your entire reason for living, and now you want me to be grateful for a life I never wanted." A neighbor's dog started barking outside, probably disturbed by the shouting. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who always asked about Miguel with such kindness, who told me what a good mother I was, how lucky Miguel was to have someone who cared so much. What would she think if she could hear this conversation? What would any of them think if they knew how my son really felt about me? "You want to know the truth?" Miguel's voice was calmer now, but somehow that made it worse. The anger I could understand, but this cold cruelty was like nothing I'd ever experienced. "I've been planning to leave for months. I've been saving money, looking at apartments. I just stayed because I felt sorry for you. Because I knew that without me, you'd have absolutely nothing." The ceramic pieces fell from my hands again. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. This was worse than when Carlos died, because at least then I'd known he loved me. At least then I'd known our life together had mattered. "You felt sorry for me?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "Of course I did. Look at you. You're 56 years old and you have no friends, no hobbies, no life outside of taking care of me. When's the last time you went anywhere that wasn't work or the grocery store? When's the last time you talked to another adult about something other than me?" I couldn't answer because he was right. Somewhere along the way, in my desperate desire to be the perfect mother, to fill the hole that Carlos's death had left in both our lives, I had indeed made Miguel my entire world. I'd stopped going out with the few friends I'd had. I'd stopped reading the books I used to love. I'd stopped painting, which had been my passion since I was a child. I'd poured everything I was into being his mother, and now he was telling me that the person I'd become disgusted him. "I can't do this anymore," he said, and his voice was finally quiet, but the words carried more weight than all his shouting had. "I can't keep being responsible for your happiness. I can't keep being the only thing in your life that matters. It's not fair to either of us." I stood up slowly, my knees aching from kneeling on the hard floor. The eggs were still splattered everywhere, but I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, and I was genuinely asking. If my love was such a burden, if my presence in his life was making him miserable, then what was I supposed to do with all this love that had nowhere to go? "I want you to go live your life," he repeated, but this time his voice was tired instead of angry. "I want you to stop making me the center of your universe. I want you to figure out who you are when you're not being my mother." The cruelest part was that I could hear the echo of reasonable advice in his words. If someone else had said these things, a therapist, a friend, anyone else, I might have recognized the truth in them. But coming from him, delivered with such coldness, such obvious resentment for everything I'd given him, they felt like a complete rejection of who I was. "And if I can't?" I whispered. "If I don't know how to be anyone else?" Miguel looked at me for a long moment, and I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or sadness. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Then that's your problem to solve," he said finally, "because I'm done solving it for you." He turned and walked toward his bedroom, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. At the doorway, he paused without turning around. "I'm moving out this weekend," he said to the wall. I already found a place. And then he was gone, leaving me standing in my kitchen surrounded by broken ceramic and scattered eggs, with the taste of my own tears mixing with the bitter understanding that the child I'd loved more than my own life had just told me he was sick of me. Sick of me. The woman who'd held him when he cried, who'd worked extra shifts to buy him the bike he wanted for Christmas, who'd sat up all night when he had pneumonia at age 7, who'd cheered at every soccer game and school play and graduation. He was sick of me. And the worst part was, I was starting to think he might be right. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended silence. Miguel moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, responding to my attempts at conversation with grunts or complete silence. I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home, afraid that any word, any gesture, might trigger another explosion of anger. I tried everything I could think of to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. I made his favorite dinner, pork chops with mashed potatoes, the recipe his grandmother had taught me when I first married Carlos. I set the table with our good china, the plates we usually saved for holidays, thinking maybe if I made the evening feel special, important, he might remember that we were family. He ate in silence, never once looking up from his plate. When I asked him how his day had been, he shrugged. When I mentioned that Mrs. Rodriguez had asked about him, wondering if he'd found work yet, his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. When I told him about the job opening I'd seen at the bank downtown, thinking maybe I was being helpful, he dropped his fork with a clatter that made me jump. "I can handle my own job search," he said without looking at me. "I don't need you managing my life." I apologized immediately, my voice small and uncertain. I was just trying to help. "Well, don't." After dinner, I cleaned the kitchen alone while he disappeared into his room. I washed the good china by hand, the way my mother had taught me, being extra careful with each piece. As I dried the plates, I caught my reflection in the window above the sink. The woman looking back at me seemed older than 56, worn down by something I couldn't quite name. When had the lines around my eyes gotten so deep? When had my shoulders started curving forward like I was trying to make myself smaller? The next morning, I decided to try a different approach. I'd always been good at reading people. It was one of the things that made me successful at the nursing home, knowing what each resident needed without them having to ask. Maybe I'd been too pushy with Miguel. Maybe he needed space, independence. Maybe I needed to show him I could respect his boundaries. So I didn't make breakfast. I had my coffee alone at the kitchen table, listening to the sounds of him getting ready in his room. When he emerged, looking for food, I smiled brightly and said, "Good morning, sweetheart. There's cereal in the cabinet and fruit on the counter." The look he gave me was withering. "What's this supposed to be? Some kind of lesson?" "No, I just thought—" I stopped myself, remembering his reaction to my thoughts the day before. "I thought you might like to handle your own breakfast." He stared at me for a long moment, and I couldn't read his expression. Then he grabbed an apple from the counter and headed for the door. "Miguel, wait," I called after him. "Where are you going?" "Out," he said without turning around. "Don't wait up." The door slammed behind him, and I was left alone with my coffee and the growing realization that I had no idea how to fix what was broken between us. Everything I'd tried, showing love through service, giving him space, trying to be supportive, seemed to make things worse. I spent the day cleaning obsessively, as if somehow making the house perfect would make everything else perfect too. I scrubbed the bathroom until it gleamed, organized closets that were already organized, dusted furniture that didn't need dusting. I was trying to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't focus on the terrible possibility that Miguel was right about me, that I really was pathetic and clingy and suffocating. When evening came and he still wasn't home, I found myself checking my phone constantly, wanting to call but knowing he'd see it as more evidence of my neediness. I made dinner anyway, just in case he came home hungry, and kept it warm in the oven until nearly midnight. Finally, I wrapped it up and put it in the refrigerator, another gesture of love that would probably go unnoticed and unappreciated. He came home at 2 a.m. I heard his key in the lock, heard him stumbling slightly as he made his way through the dark house. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should get up and ask if he needed anything. But I remembered his words about hovering, about being pathetic, so I stayed where I was, listening to him bang around in the kitchen. The The next day, I tried yet again. This time, I decided to give him what he'd asked for. I would go live my own life. I made plans to visit my sister Elena, who lived 2 hours away. I hadn't seen her in months because I'd always been so focused on Miguel, so worried about leaving him alone for too long. "I'm going to Elena's for the day," I announced at breakfast, trying to sound casual and confident, like a woman who had her own life and interests. Miguel looked up from his phone, surprised. "Okay, I'll be back this evening. There's leftover casserole in the fridge if you get hungry. I'm 32, Mom. I think I can figure out how to feed myself for one day." The casual cruelty of his tone hit me like a slap. Even when I was trying to do what he wanted, trying to be less involved in his life, he found new ways to make me feel small and foolish. The drive to Elena's should have been peaceful, a chance to clear my head and gain some perspective. Instead, I spent the entire 2 hours replaying every conversation Miguel and I had ever had, searching for clues about when exactly everything had gone wrong. When had my love become a burden? When had my presence in his life become something to endure rather than appreciate? Elena was shocked by my appearance. "Eloisa, you look terrible," she said as soon as she opened the door. "Are you sick?" I hadn't realized how much the stress was showing on my face, how much weight I'd lost from my appetite disappearing along with my happiness. Elena made me sit at her kitchen table while she bustled around making tea, her concern evident in every gesture. "Tell me what's happening," she said gently. "You sounded strange on the phone." So I told her everything. About Miguel's anger, about his cruel words, about how I felt like I was walking through my own life as a stranger. Elena listened without interrupting, her face growing more troubled with each detail I shared. "Eloisa," she said finally, "this isn't normal. The way he's treating you isn't okay. But maybe he's right," I said, voicing the fear that had been growing inside me. "Maybe I have been too clingy, too dependent on him for my happiness. Maybe I don't know how to be anything other than his mother. So what if that's true?" Elena's voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Even if you made mistakes, even if you loved him too much, does that give him the right to be cruel to you? Does that make it okay for him to speak to you like you're nothing?" I stared at my sister, seeing my own situation reflected in her angry eyes. Elena had always been stronger than me, more willing to fight for herself. She'd never understood my need to make everyone else happy, my instinct to apologize first and ask questions later. "You raised that boy alone after Carlos died," she continued. "You worked yourself to the bone to give him everything he needed, and now he's treating you like you're some kind of burden he can't wait to get rid of. That's not about you being too loving, Eloisa. That's about him being ungrateful and cruel." But as much as I wanted to believe my sister, as much as I needed to hear someone defend me, I couldn't shake Miguel's words. Maybe Elena didn't understand because she'd never made the mistakes I'd made. She'd raised 3 children while maintaining her own friendships, her own interests. She'd never lost herself in motherhood the way I had. The drive home felt endless. I kept imagining different scenarios. Maybe Miguel would be waiting for me with an apology. Maybe he'd realized how harsh he'd been and would want to start over. Maybe seeing me assert some independence would remind him that I was more than just his overbearing mother. Instead, I came home to a note on the kitchen counter. "Staying at a friend's tonight, back tomorrow to pack." He was really leaving. In less than 24 hours, my son would be gone, and based on his behavior this week, I had no reason to believe he'd want to maintain any kind of relationship with me afterward. I was about to become exactly what he'd accused me of being, a woman with no purpose, no identity outside of being his mother. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at his note, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself cry. Not the silent tears I'd been shedding at night when I was sure he couldn't hear me, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place I'd never accessed before. I cried for the little boy who used to tell me I was his best friend. I cried for the relationship I'd thought we had. I cried for the woman I used to be before I disappeared into the role of devoted mother. But mostly, I cried because I was finally beginning to understand that Miguel might be gone from my life forever. And I had no idea who I was supposed to be without him. The morning Miguel came to pack his things, I made myself invisible. I heard him moving around the house, opening closets, dragging boxes, but I stayed in my bedroom with the door closed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of my son erasing himself from my life. Every thud of a box hitting the floor felt like another piece of my heart breaking off. Every drawer that opened and closed was another memory being packed away. I could picture him in there, sorting through his belongings, deciding what was worth taking to his new life and what could be left behind with his pathetic mother. I wanted to help him. Even in the midst of my devastation, my instinct was to make things easier for him, to fold his clothes properly, to make sure he had everything he needed. But I forced myself to stay in my room because I knew that any attempt to be useful would only confirm everything he'd said about me being clingy and suffocating. Around noon, I heard voices. Miguel had brought someone to help him, a male voice I didn't recognize, probably one of the friends he'd mentioned but never brought home. They were laughing about something, their voices echoing through the house like this was just another ordinary moving day instead of the complete destruction of everything I'd built my life around. "Yeah, I should have done this years ago," I heard Miguel say as they passed by my bedroom door. Living here was killing me, man. I felt like I was drowning. In my love, in my care, in everything I'd given him, thinking it would help him heal from losing his father. I'd been so focused on making sure he never felt abandoned again that I'd somehow become the thing he needed to escape from. The friend said something I couldn't make out, and Miguel laughed. "You have no idea. She still makes my bed when I forget to do it. She still packs my lunch like I'm going to school. It's like living with a hovering ghost who thinks I'm still 12 years old." A hovering ghost. Is that really how he saw me? Not as his mother who loved him, but as some pathetic specter haunting his life, unable to accept that he'd grown up. The words cut deeper than anything he'd said to my face because they revealed how he really talked about me when I wasn't around. How long had he been describing me this way to his friends? How long had I been a joke to people I didn't even know? "The guilt trips are the worst part," Miguel continued, and I found myself straining to hear every cruel word. "She never says anything directly, but she has this way of looking at you like a kicked puppy when you don't do what she wants. Like she sacrificed everything for you, and the least you can do is appreciate it. But I had sacrificed everything. I'd given up my painting, my friendships, my own dreams, all so he could have the stability he needed after his father died. I'd worked double shifts and lived on ramen noodles so he could have name-brand clothes and school supplies. I'd turned down dates and social invitations because spending time with him felt more important than anything else I could be doing. Apparently, that had been my mistake. The moving continued for hours. I listened to them carry load after load out to what I assumed was a truck or van. Each trip felt like they were dismantling not just Miguel's belongings, but the entire structure of my existence. When they were finished, the house would be empty in ways that had nothing to do with furniture or possessions. Around 4 o'clock, everything went quiet. I heard the front door close, then the sound of an engine starting in the driveway. For a moment, I thought he'd left without saying goodbye. And even though part of me had been dreading that final conversation, the idea that he could just disappear felt like the ultimate rejection. But then I heard footsteps coming back into the house, slow and hesitant. Miguel's voice called out, "Mom? Are you here?" I should have answered. A stronger woman, a woman with more dignity, would have emerged from her bedroom and faced this moment head-on. But I couldn't make myself move. I couldn't make myself open that door and look at my son knowing it might be the last time I ever saw him. The footsteps came closer, stopping outside my bedroom door. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I wondered what he was thinking, whether he was having second thoughts about leaving, whether some part of him was remembering all the good times we'd had together. "I'm going now," he said finally, his voice muffled by the door between us. I left my new address on the kitchen table, in case there's mail or whatever. Mail or whatever. Not in case I wanted to visit, or call, or maintain any kind of relationship with him. Just in case there were administrative details that required his attention. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell him I loved him, that I was proud of him, that I hoped he'd be happy in his new life. I wanted to apologize for all the ways I'd apparently failed him as a mother. I wanted to beg him not to leave, to give me another chance to be the kind of person he could stand to be around. But the words wouldn't come. My throat felt like it was closing up, like my body was rejecting the possibility of speech. So I lay there in silence while my only child said goodbye to me through a closed door. "Take care of yourself, okay?" he added. And for just a moment, his voice sounded almost gentle, almost like the boy who used to crawl into my lap when he was sad. Then the footsteps moved away, and I heard the front door open and close one final time. The engine started again, and this time it didn't stop. I listened to the sound growing fainter and fainter until it disappeared completely, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. I don't know how long I lay there before I finally got up. The light outside my window had changed from afternoon brightness to the softer glow of early evening. My body felt stiff and sore, like I'd been lying in the same position for hours, which I probably had. When I finally opened my bedroom door, the house felt different immediately. Not just empty, but hollow, like a shell that had been cleaned out by the tide. I walked through the rooms Miguel had occupied, seeing the spaces where his furniture had been, the clean rectangles on the carpet where his belongings had protected the floor from years of sunlight. His bedroom was the worst. The walls were covered with lighter patches where his posters had hung, and there were small holes where he'd tacked up pictures and certificates over the years. The closet gaped open and empty, still holding the scent of his cologne mixed with laundry detergent. I stood in the doorway, remembering all the nights I'd tucked him into the bed that was no longer there, all the mornings I'd woken him up for school, all the times I'd sat on the edge of that mattress to comfort him when he was sick or scared or sad. On the kitchen table, as promised, was a piece of paper with his new address written in his careful handwriting. The apartment was across town, far enough away that I wouldn't accidentally run into him at the grocery store or the bank. He'd made sure there would be no uncomfortable coincidental meetings, no opportunities for me to insert myself into his life uninvited. Beside the address was something else. My spare house key, the one I'd given him years ago so he'd never be locked out. Never feel like he didn't belong here. Seeing it sitting there on the table felt like the final rejection, the ultimate proof that he no longer considered this place his home. I picked up the key and held it in my palm, feeling its familiar weight. This small piece of metal represented so much: trust, belonging, family. Now it was just another abandoned object, no more meaningful than the dust bunnies I'd found under his bed. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that grew cold while I stared at the address he'd left behind. I thought about all the things I wanted to say to him, all the explanations and apologies that were trapped inside me with nowhere to go. I thought about writing him a letter, trying to make him understand that everything I'd done had come from love, not from a desire to control or suffocate him. But what would be the point? He'd made his feelings perfectly clear. He didn't want my love, didn't want my care, didn't want me in his life at all. A letter would just be another example of me refusing to respect his boundaries, another way of forcing my presence on someone who'd explicitly told me he was sick of me. For the first time since Carlos died, I was completely alone. No one to cook for, no one to worry about, no one to shape my days around. The freedom Miguel had insisted I needed felt like being lost in an endless desert with no landmarks to guide me home. I tried to imagine what tomorrow would look like, and the day after that, and all the days stretching ahead into a future I'd never planned for. Who was I supposed to be now? What was I supposed to do with all this love that had nowhere to go? But I still had something Miguel didn't know about. Something he'd forgotten in his rush to escape my suffocating devotion. Something that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. The letter sat in my jewelry box for 3 weeks before I finally took it out and read it again. It was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but every word was still clear. My mother had written it to me shortly before she died, when I was 25 and newly married to Carlos. I'd read it countless times over the years, especially during difficult moments when I needed to remember who I used to be. "My dearest Eloisa," it began in my mother's careful script. "You have always been the artist in our family, the dreamer, the one who sees beauty where others see ordinary things. Never let anyone convince you that your gifts don't matter. Never let love make you so small that you disappear into someone else's life and forget your own light." When I first received this letter, I'd thought my mother was being overly dramatic. I was young and in love and couldn't imagine ever losing myself in a relationship. Carlos encouraged my painting, hung my artwork throughout our house, bragged to his friends about his talented wife. Back then, the idea that love could diminish me instead of elevate me seemed impossible. But my mother had been right. Somewhere in the process of becoming a wife and then a mother, I had indeed made myself smaller and smaller until there was almost nothing left of the woman I used to be. I'd packed away my easel after Miguel was born, telling myself I'd return to painting when he was older, when I had more time, when life was less demanding. 28 years later, my art supplies were still in boxes in the basement, gathering dust and probably ruined by moisture. 28 years of telling myself that my dreams could wait, that other people's needs were more important than my own creative expression. I spent those 3 weeks after Miguel left in a strange state of suspended animation. I'd wake up each morning, and for just a moment, I'd forget that everything had changed. I'd start to call out to ask if he wanted breakfast, or I'd find myself automatically setting 2 places at the table. Then reality would crash back over me, leaving me feeling foolish and untethered. The silence in the house was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy with all the words that had been said and all the words that would never be said. I found myself talking to the walls sometimes, just to hear a human voice, even if it was only my own. But gradually, something began to shift. The constant anxiety I'd been living with, the worry about Miguel's mood, his needs, his opinion of me, started to fade. For the first time in years, I could eat breakfast without wondering if the smell of coffee would wake him up too early. I could watch whatever I wanted on television without considering whether he'd approve of my choices. I could go to bed when I was tired instead of staying up until he came home, just to make sure he was safe. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. One morning, about a month after he'd left, I found myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in years. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, tired, gray-haired, with lines of worry etched permanently around her eyes. When had I stopped caring about my appearance? When had I stopped seeing myself as anything other than Miguel's mother? I remembered being 25, 30, even 40, and feeling beautiful. I remembered Carlos telling me I had the most expressive eyes he'd ever seen, that my smile could light up a room. I remembered feeling confident in my own skin, comfortable with who I was as a person rather than just as someone's caretaker. That woman was still in there somewhere, buried under years of self-sacrifice and diminished expectations. Maybe it wasn't too late to find her again. I started small. I bought new shampoo, something expensive that smelled like lavender instead of the cheap brand I'd been using for years to save money. I cleaned out my closet, getting rid of clothes that were worn out or unflattering, keeping only things that made me feel like myself. Most of my wardrobe ended up in donation bags, leaving me with just a few pieces that actually fit properly and made me feel attractive. Then I did something I hadn't done in decades. I went shopping for myself, not for groceries or household necessities, but for things I wanted. A soft blue sweater that brought out my eyes, a pair of earrings that caught the light when I moved, a book of poetry that had nothing to do with anyone's needs but my own. The saleswoman at the department store was kind, offering suggestions and compliments that seemed genuine. "That color is perfect on you," she said as I tried on the blue sweater. "It makes you look radiant." Radiant. When was the last time anyone had described me that way? When was the last time I'd felt radiant? I bought the sweater and wore it home, catching glimpses of myself in store windows as I walked. The woman reflected there looked different. Not younger exactly, but more alive somehow, more present in her own life. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 28 years. I went down to the basement and found my old art supplies. The easel was warped, and some of the paints had dried out completely, but my brushes were still good. I cleaned them carefully, remembering the feel of them in my hands, the way each one created different textures and effects. I set up the easel in the living room, right where Miguel's couch used to be. For hours, I just stared at the blank canvas, afraid to make the first mark. What if I'd lost the ability completely? What if 28 years away from art had erased whatever talent I'd once had? But then I remembered my mother's words. "You have always been the artist in our family, the dreamer. the one who sees beauty where others see ordinary things. I picked up a brush and made a single stroke of blue across the canvas. Then another. Before I knew it, I was lost in the process, mixing colors, layering paint, creating something that existed purely because I wanted it to exist. The painting wasn't good. I was too out of practice for that. But it was mine. For the first time in decades, I was doing something purely for my own satisfaction, not because anyone needed me to do it, or because it would make someone else's life easier. I painted for 3 hours that night, until my back ached from standing and my hands were stained with colors I'd forgotten I loved. When I finally stepped back to look at what I'd created, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd forgotten what to call it. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The next morning, I woke up excited about something for the first time in months. I couldn't wait to get back to the easel, to see what would emerge from the canvas today. I made coffee and toast and ate breakfast while looking at my painting from the night before, studying the brushstrokes and planning what I wanted to do next. It wasn't until I was washing my dishes that I realized something profound had happened. I'd gone an entire evening and morning without thinking about Miguel, not wondering what he was doing, not worrying about whether he was eating properly, or if he was happy in his new apartment. For 12 hours, I'd been completely present in my own life instead of existing as a satellite orbiting around his. It should have made me feel guilty. What kind of mother stops thinking about her child? But instead, it felt like breathing after holding my breath for 3 decades. I called in sick to work that day, which I'd never done unless I was genuinely ill. Instead, I spent the entire day painting, breaking only to eat a sandwich standing up in the kitchen so I wouldn't lose momentum. I painted until the light faded and my eyes were too tired to see clearly. That night, I sat on the floor in front of my easel. I'd forgotten to buy a chair when I set up my makeshift studio, and really looked at what I'd accomplished. It wasn't professional quality, but it was recognizably mine. I could see my perspective, my way of interpreting light and shadow, my instinct for color combinations that other people might not think to try. I was still an artist. After all these years of believing I'd lost that part of myself forever, it had been there all along, waiting patiently for me to remember it existed. For the first time since Miguel had screamed at me in the kitchen, I felt like I might survive this. More than survive, I might actually thrive. But I had no idea that across town, in his new apartment, Miguel was beginning to discover what life looked like without the safety net he'd been taking for granted his entire adult life. I had no idea that his cruel words were about to come back to haunt him in ways he'd never imagined. It wasn't anger anymore that was growing inside me. It was something much more powerful. It was decision. 2 months passed before I wrote the letter. 2 months of painting every evening until my fingers ached, of rediscovering muscles in my back I'd forgotten existed from standing at the easel, of falling asleep with paint under my fingernails and waking up eager to return to my canvas. 2 months of slowly, deliberately rebuilding myself from the inside out. The woman who sat down at the kitchen table that October evening was not the same woman Miguel had screamed at in this very room. I was wearing the blue sweater that made me feel radiant. My hair was freshly cut in a style that framed my face instead of hiding it, and my hands, stained permanently now with traces of cerulean and ochre, moved with a confidence I hadn't felt in decades. The letter started simply, "My dear Miguel," not "my son," not "sweetheart," or any of the endearing terms I'd used his entire life, just his name, clean and formal, the way I might address any adult who had hurt me deeply. I wrote about the morning he left, about listening to him pack his belongings while I hid in my bedroom like a wounded animal. I wrote about the things he'd said to his friend, the hovering ghost comment, the kicked puppy comparison, all the cruel observations he'd made about a woman who had sacrificed everything for his happiness. But I didn't write with anger. Anger would have given him permission to dismiss me again, to roll his eyes and tell himself that his mother was being dramatic and manipulative. Instead, I wrote with the calm precision of someone stating facts. "You told your friend that living with me was killing you, that you felt like you were drowning," I wrote. "I want you to know that I heard every word. I want you to know that the woman you described, pathetic, clingy, suffocating, was indeed who I had become. You were right about that. What you were wrong about was thinking that this transformation happened in a vacuum. I wrote about the 18 years I'd worked at the nursing home, coming home exhausted every night to make his dinner, help with homework, listen to his problems. I wrote about the paintings I'd never finished, the friendships I'd let wither, the dreams I'd deferred indefinitely because his needs always came first. I made myself smaller every day for 32 years, I continued, until I nearly disappeared entirely. I thought this was what love looked like, erasing yourself for someone else's comfort. I was wrong. But my mistake was in the method, not in the love itself. The letter was 3 pages long when I finished, single-spaced, every word chosen carefully. I didn't ask for his forgiveness or beg him to reconsider his decision to cut me out of his life. I didn't threaten or manipulate or try to make him feel guilty. I simply told him the truth about what his rejection had cost and what it had taught me. The final paragraph was the most important. I want you to know that I'm not writing this letter because I expect you to change your mind about me. I'm writing it because I've learned that silence can be mistaken for acceptance, and I need you to understand that I do not accept the way you treated me. I deserved better from you, Miguel. I deserved better from myself. It has taken me 56 years to understand this, but understanding it has set me free. I signed it simply, Eloisa, not Mom or Love Mother, just my name, the name of a woman who had finally remembered she existed as more than someone's caretaker. I didn't mail the letter immediately. Instead, I placed it in a manila envelope and set it on my kitchen counter, where I could see it every morning while I drank my coffee. For a week, I looked at that envelope and asked myself whether sending it was the right choice. Would it accomplish anything meaningful, or was I just seeking the last word in an argument I'd already lost? But every evening, as I stood at my easel mixing colors and losing myself in the meditation of creation, I knew the letter needed to be sent, not because I expected it to change Miguel's heart, but because I needed to complete the process of reclaiming my voice. On the 7th day, I walked to the post office and mailed it. Meanwhile, across town, Miguel was learning lessons of his own, though he didn't know yet that they were lessons. His new apartment was everything he'd told himself he wanted. Modern, spacious, with gleaming appliances and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in floods of natural light. The rent was more than he'd anticipated, but he'd found a decent job at a marketing firm, and for the first few weeks, everything seemed to be going according to plan. But living alone, truly alone, for the first time in his adult life, turned out to be more challenging than he'd expected. There was no one to split the grocery bill with, no one to cook meals he could share or complain to about his difficult boss. The silence he'd craved after years of what he'd called my hovering began to feel less like peace and more like isolation. His friends, the ones who'd helped him move and laughed about his overbearing mother, turned out to be less available for regular socializing than he'd assumed. They had their own lives, their own relationships, their own responsibilities. The casual hangouts he'd imagined were replaced by occasional text messages and increasingly rare invitations to group activities where he often felt like an outsider. The job that had seemed like such a step up from his previous position revealed itself to be demanding in ways he hadn't anticipated. His new boss was exacting, critical, unimpressed by excuses or explanations. When Miguel missed a deadline because he'd stayed out too late the night before, there was no sympathetic mother to vent to, no one to reassure him that his boss was being unreasonable. By the time my letter arrived at his apartment, Miguel had been living on his own for nearly 3 months, and the independence he'd fought so hard to achieve was beginning to feel less like freedom and more like a burden he wasn't sure he was strong enough to carry. I knew none of this, of course. I was too busy rediscovering myself to wonder whether Miguel was struggling with his new life. My days had developed a rhythm that felt natural and satisfying. Work, grocery shopping, cooking simple meals for one, and then hours at my easel where time seemed to suspend itself entirely. I'd started taking art classes at the community college, something I'd always wanted to do, but had never made time for when my evenings were dedicated to Miguel's needs. The other students were mostly women my age or older, women who'd raised children and supported husbands, and were now, finally, pursuing interests they'd deferred for decades. "You have such an interesting use of color," my instructor, Professor Walsh, said during one critique session. There's something very emotional about your work, very honest. Have you been painting long? 28 years, I answered, and then corrected myself. Actually, I painted for 28 years, then stopped for 28 years, and now I'm starting again. She nodded as if this made perfect sense. The gap shows in your technique. You're a bit rusty with some fundamentals, but it also shows in your perspective. There's a depth to these pieces that comes from living, from experiencing loss and renewal. That can't be taught. After class, a woman named Dorothy approached me. She was probably 70, with silver hair and paint-stained fingers that reminded me of my own. I heard what you said about the 28-year gap, she said. I had a 15-year gap myself, raised 4 children, took care of my mother when she got sick, put my husband through graduate school. When I finally picked up a brush again, I thought I'd lost everything. But you know what I discovered? I waited for her answer, curious. The artist was still there. Older, maybe wiser, definitely more patient, but still there, waiting for me to remember her. Dorothy smiled and touched my arm gently. Don't mourn the lost years, dear. Celebrate the found ones. That night, I painted until 3 a.m, losing myself completely in a landscape that seemed to emerge from some deep place I'd forgotten existed. When I finally stepped back, exhausted but exhilarated, I understood what Dorothy meant. The artist hadn't disappeared during those 28 years of motherhood and sacrifice. She'd been quietly observing, accumulating experiences and emotions and perspectives that were now flowing through my brush with an intensity I'd never achieved in my younger years. I was better now than I'd ever been. Not technically. I still had decades of practice to make up for, but emotionally, spiritually. My work had a weight to it now. A substance born from having lived through real loss and discovered real strength. 3 weeks after I mailed the letter, I received a phone call that would change everything, but I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that for the first time in my adult life, I was completely, genuinely happy with who I was becoming, and I was about to discover that the universe had been keeping track of debts that needed to be repaid. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while I was cleaning my brushes after a particularly satisfying painting session. I'd been working on a piece inspired by the coastal town I'd been dreaming about visiting. Somewhere quiet and beautiful where I could start completely fresh if I chose to. The phone's sharp ring cut through the peaceful silence I'd grown to treasure. Is this Eloisa Morrison? The voice was unfamiliar, professional, but tinged with something that might have been concern. Yes, this is Eloisa. Mrs. Morrison, this is Janet Chen from Mercy General Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Miguel Morrison. You're listed as his emergency contact. My heart stopped. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the cruel words and the deliberate separation, Miguel was still my child. The maternal instinct that had defined me for 32 years surged forward, overwhelming the careful emotional boundaries I'd been building. Is he hurt? What happened? He's stable now, but he was brought in this afternoon after collapsing at work. We've run several tests and we need to discuss his condition with a family member. Are you able to come to the hospital? I was already reaching for my car keys before she finished speaking. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Mercy General felt like traveling through a dream where everything looked familiar, but nothing made sense. I'd driven these streets countless times, but never with this particular combination of fear and uncertainty churning in my stomach. Part of me wondered if Miguel had changed his emergency contact information, if Janet Chen would discover her mistake and turn me away at the hospital door. But when I arrived and gave my name at the nurses' station, they directed me to the 3rd floor without question. Apparently, in his months of independence, Miguel had never gotten around to removing me from his medical information. The irony wasn't lost on me. He could erase me from his daily life, but bureaucratic paperwork kept us connected in ways he'd forgotten about. Dr. Patel was a small woman with kind eyes and the sort of gentle manner that probably served her well when delivering difficult news to frightened families. She led me to a quiet consultation room and closed the door before speaking. Mrs. Morrison, your son has been under a great deal of stress lately. The collapse was caused by a combination of exhaustion, poor nutrition, and what appears to be anxiety-related symptoms. His blood work shows signs of chronic stress, and he's lost considerable weight since his last physical. I listened to her words while images flashed through my mind. Miguel as a child, refusing to eat when he was upset, the way stress had always manifested in his body. Is he going to be okay? Physically, yes, with proper rest and nutrition. But Mrs. Morrison, he's been asking for you since he woke up. He seems quite distressed about something, and he keeps saying he needs to apologize to you. Do you know what that might be about? The question hung in the air between us. How could I explain to this kind doctor that my son had spent months convincing himself he was better off without me, only to discover that cutting himself off from his only family had left him more alone and vulnerable than he'd ever imagined? We had a disagreement, I said carefully. We haven't spoken in several months. Dr. Patel nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen family estrangements play out in hospital rooms before. Would you like to see him? He's awake, and I think it might help his recovery to resolve whatever's troubling him. I followed her down a corridor lined with doors that all looked the same, each one hiding its own story of human frailty and the family members who gathered around hospital beds to offer whatever comfort they could. Miguel's room was near the end of the hall, and through the small window in the door, I could see him lying in the narrow bed, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen him since he was a child. He'd lost weight, just as Dr. Patel had mentioned, and his face had the hollow look of someone who hadn't been taking proper care of himself. His hair was longer and unkempt, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and accumulated stress. When I stepped into the room, his eyes opened immediately, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could see him taking in my appearance, the new haircut, the blue sweater that made me feel confident, the paint stains on my fingers that revealed how I'd been spending my time. "Mom?" His voice was hoarse, uncertain. Nothing like the angry tone he'd used during our last conversation. "Hello, Miguel." I kept my voice gentle, but didn't rush to his bedside the way the old Eloisa would have. I'd learned the difference between love and desperation, between caring and self-erasure. "You came." He sounded genuinely surprised, as if he'd convinced himself that his rejection had been so complete, so final, that I wouldn't respond even to a medical emergency. "Of course I came. You're in the hospital." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with something. Pride, maybe, or shame, or the simple difficulty of finding words for feelings he'd been trying to ignore for months. "I got your letter," he said finally. "I hoped you would. I've read it probably 50 times. I kept it on my kitchen counter for weeks. Every morning when I made coffee, I'd read it again." His voice cracked slightly. "Mom, I was so wrong about everything." I moved closer to his bed but didn't reach for him. I needed to hear what he had to say before I could know how to respond. "The things I said to you. The way I treated you." He closed his eyes, and I could see tears leaking from the corners. "I told myself you were suffocating me, that I needed to get away from you to become independent. But the truth is, I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared of being responsible for your happiness. Scared that if I stayed close to you, I'd never learn to take care of myself. Scared that you loved me more than you loved yourself, and that somehow made me responsible for your whole life." He opened his eyes and looked directly at me. "But mostly, I was scared that I was turning into the kind of person who would take advantage of that love without giving anything back." I felt something shift inside my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. This was the conversation I'd needed to have with him months ago, but I understood now that he hadn't been ready to hear it then. Sometimes people have to lose something completely before they can understand its value. "You were taking advantage of it," I said quietly. "But that doesn't excuse the cruelty, Miguel. It doesn't excuse telling me you were sick of me, or talking about me like I was some pathetic burden you couldn't wait to escape." He flinched, as if I'd slapped him. "I know." "God, Mom, I know. Do you want to know what my life has been like since I moved out?" I waited, curious despite myself. "Lonely. Harder than I ever imagined. I had no idea how much work you did to make our house feel like a home, how much you did to make my life easier without me even noticing. The first week in my apartment, I ran out of toilet paper and had no idea where to buy it. The second week, I got food poisoning because I didn't know how to tell if chicken had gone bad. Last month, I got locked out and had to pay a locksmith $200 because I didn't have anyone to call who had a spare key. Despite everything, I felt a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. You could have called me for any of those things. No, I couldn't. Not after what I said to you. Not after I told you to go live your own life and stop making me the center of your universe. He paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize features they were afraid they might never see again. But you did it, didn't you? You went and built a life without me. It wasn't a question. And I realized he was right. The woman sitting beside his hospital bed was fundamentally different from the one he'd screamed at in the kitchen 4 months ago. I had, indeed, built a life without him. A good life. A life that belonged entirely to me. Yes, I said simply. I did. Something in his expression crumbled then, and I realized he was finally understanding the full weight of what he'd thrown away. I want to come home, Mom. The words tumbled out of Miguel like a confession he'd been holding back for months. I want to come back and start over and try to be the son you deserved all along. I looked at my son lying in that hospital bed, pale and vulnerable and genuinely remorseful, and I felt the old maternal instinct stirring, the urge to comfort him, to fix everything, to open my arms and my home and make his pain disappear. It would have been so easy to slip back into the role I'd played for 32 years, the devoted mother who put everyone else's needs before her own. But I'd learned something important during these months of rebuilding myself. Love doesn't require self-erasure. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and helping someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself on the altar of their comfort. Miguel, I said gently, I can see that you're sorry. I can see that you've learned some difficult lessons these past few months. But I'm not the same woman you left behind in that kitchen. He blinked, confusion flickering across his features. What do you mean? I mean that the woman who would have dropped everything to take care of you, who would have welcomed you back without question and spent the rest of her life trying to make up for your mistakes, that woman doesn't exist anymore. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd spent most of my adult life, but was finally seeing with new eyes. I've spent the last 4 months discovering who I am when I'm not being your mother. I've remembered that I'm an artist, that I'm interesting, that I have value beyond my ability to serve other people's needs. Mom, Let me finish. My voice was firm but not unkind. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's the truth, and you need to hear it. I forgive you for the cruel things you said. I forgive you for taking my love for granted all these years. But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm willing to go back to the way things were. Miguel stared at me, and I could see him processing this new reality. His mother, the woman who had always been his safety net, was establishing boundaries he'd never had to consider before. I don't understand what you're saying, he whispered. I'm saying that if you want a relationship with me, it has to be a relationship between two adults who respect each other. I'm not your caretaker anymore, Miguel. I'm not responsible for managing your life or making your mistakes easier to bear. I'm your mother and I love you, but I'm also a woman with my own dreams and priorities. I turned back to face him, and I could see my reflection in the dark window behind me. A woman with confidence in her posture, with paint-stained fingers that spoke of creativity reclaimed, with eyes that held the wisdom of someone who'd been broken and had reassembled herself into something stronger. I've been thinking about moving, I continued. There's a small coastal town about 3 hours from here where I could rent a studio, maybe teach art classes, start completely fresh. I haven't decided yet. But for the first time in my adult life, I'm making decisions based on what I want rather than what other people need from me. You'd leave? The panic in his voice was unmistakable. I might. Or I might stay and continue building the life I've started here. Either way, Miguel, my choices are going to be mine from now on. He was quiet for a long time, absorbing the full implications of what I was telling him. Finally, he spoke again, his voice smaller than before. Is there any chance? Could we maybe try to build something new? Something healthier than what we had before? I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or the old entitlement I'd grown so accustomed to. Instead, I saw something I'd rarely seen from him. Genuine humility. Maybe, I said. But it would have to be on different terms. You'd have to prove that you can see me as a person, not just as your mother. You'd have to show that you value my presence in your life rather than taking it for granted. And you'd have to accept that I have my own life now, my own interests, my own priorities. I want to try, he said quickly. I want to learn how to be better. Then start by getting yourself healthy. Not because I'm here to take care of you, but because you're an adult who's responsible for his own well-being. Learn to cook proper meals, get enough sleep, find ways to manage stress that don't involve collapsing at work. Miguel nodded, and I could see him trying to imagine this new version of himself, competent, self-sufficient, worthy of an adult relationship with his mother rather than a dependent one. And Miguel? I added, my voice softer now. When you're ready, I'd like you to meet the woman I've become. She's an artist, you know. She's talented and interesting, and she has friends who respect her for who she is rather than what she can do for them. I think you might like her. For the first time since I'd entered his hospital room, Miguel smiled. Not the entitled, expectant smile I remembered from his childhood, but something sadder and more genuine. I'd like that, he said. I'd like to meet her very much. I reached over and squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture of love that didn't require me to diminish myself. I'm going to go now. The nurse said they'll probably discharge you tomorrow if your blood work improves. Make sure someone drives you home, and make sure you follow up with your doctor. Will you call me? Maybe we could have coffee sometime? I paused at the door, considering his request. I'll think about it. If I do call, it will be because I want to, not because I feel obligated to. Do you understand the difference? He nodded slowly. I think I'm beginning to. 2 weeks later, Miguel called me, not with an emergency or a demand for immediate attention, but with a simple invitation to meet for coffee at a cafe downtown. When I arrived, I barely recognized the man sitting at the corner table. He'd gained back some of the weight he'd lost, and his clothes looked clean and well-fitted. But more importantly, there was something different in his posture, in the way he looked at me when I approached the table. For the first time in years, he seemed to actually see me, rather than just seeing what he needed from me. You look beautiful, Mom, he said as I sat down, and I could tell he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with how I could serve him. Thank you. You look healthier. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about the changes he was making in his life. Cooking classes, therapy to work through his issues with independence and entitlement, a genuine effort to build friendships based on mutual respect rather than convenience. I told him about my painting, about the art classes, about the possibility of moving to the coast if the right opportunity arose. I want you to be happy, he said as we prepared to leave. Whatever that looks like for you, wherever that takes you. I want you to be happy, and I don't want my presence in your life to be contingent on your happiness revolving around me. Those words, coming from the son who had once screamed that he was sick of me, felt like the greatest gift he'd ever given me. 6 months later, I did move to the coastal town I'd been dreaming about. I rented a small house with a large window perfect for painting, and I opened a studio where I teach art to women who, like me, are discovering that it's never too late to reclaim the parts of yourself you thought were lost forever. Miguel visits once a month. We have dinner, we talk about his job, and my students and the books we're reading. Sometimes we don't talk much at all. Just sit on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in colors I try to capture later with my brushes. He never stays more than 2 days, and he always asks permission before extending his visit. He helps with dishes without being asked, brings groceries without being told what I need, treats me like a beloved friend rather than a servant. Last week he brought a woman with him, Sarah, someone he's been dating for 3 months. She was kind and intelligent, and I could see that she liked Miguel for who he was rather than what he could provide her. More importantly, I could see that he was proud to introduce me to her, proud of the life I'd built, proud to call me his mother. I used to think, he told Sarah as we sat on the porch after dinner, that my mom lived for me. It was suffocating and guilt-inducing and unfair to both of us. Now I understand that she lives her own life, and she chooses to include me in it. That's a completely different thing, and it's so much better. As I listened to him explain our relationship to someone else, I realized that the justice I'd found wasn't the dramatic, vengeful kind that movies promised. It was quieter than that, deeper than that. It was the justice of knowing my own worth, of refusing to accept less than I deserved, of building a life so fulfilling that other people's approval became optional rather than essential. I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away, not in anger, but in love for yourself. I learned that silence can speak louder than screaming, that dignity is more compelling than desperation, and that the woman who knows her own value is impossible to diminish. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to remember who you were before you became who everyone else needed you to be. My name is Eloisa, and I am 57 years old. I am an artist, a teacher, a woman who has loved deeply and lost greatly and found herself again on the other side of heartbreak. I am proof that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is refuse to let them treat you badly. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that refusal becomes the gift that saves you both.